Hi everyone, welcome to the next episode of our vlog. I'm really appreciating all of the questions that are coming in and the comments and things like that, because I'm finding it's actually giving a bit of a direction to what we're doing, because it was so new, we didn't really know how the whole thing was going to fit together. So this way we have an idea of the kind of things that you're interested in. And one of the big things that keeps coming up over and over again, we're discovering, is you want to know a lot about pattern modification and fitting garments for your size and making changes to garments. So that seems to be a big overriding thing that's coming in. Which actually makes a lot of sense, because for me it is very much along the lines of what I'm interested in. It's what I think about a lot when I sit down to design something. More often than not, it is going to be a garment. So I spend a lot of time thinking about garments, how different stitch pattern fits into them, how I can modify it for myself or for someone else, and how I can take something that I envisioned in my head and I know what I wanted to look like, and translate that into a pattern that's a little easier to follow, and will hopefully give most people either the end result they want, or enough information that if you need to modify it, you know how to, and it should be fairly straightforward to do that. Now obviously modification, if you're going to do big modifications on sweaters, you need to be very careful about what you're doing. You need to make sure you've done your gauge swatches and things like that, so that when you make the change, you know how the change is going to come out on the other end. So the two things that those two big questions kind of came up from the last couple of episodes that I've been doing. And the first one was talking about modifying a sweater by using a different yarn, like a heavier yarn or a lighter yarn. And that it's a possibility, but it comes with its own difficulties, because different thicknesses of yarn will behave differently. So if you have a pattern that's written for, we'll say, a DK weight yarn, so middle of the range, not too heavy, not too light, and you decide, oh, I actually want to make this smaller than the smallest pattern sizes, I'm going to go knit it in a fingering weight. So that's a fairly big difference between the two, which is going to mean that you might have a couple of different things going on. First of all, you're probably going to have a much larger gauge. So for instance, if it was 20 stitches per 4 inches, your fingering gauge knit at a standard gauge for that might be more like 28 stitches. So that would be an enormous difference. And then that's going to have a very big impact on the finished size of your garment. You can do that by actually calculating the difference that the gauge will make by taking your gauge and dividing it by the other gauge. I will in a minute pull up just a little bit of a sketch showing you how you can go about doing that. But what it will mean is that it's going to look very different, and all of the other parts are going to change as well. So your neck width will be different, the lengths of things will be different where the decreases happen. So if you make a really big change, it's going to have potentially a lot of other knock-on implications as you go through that you may not have actually thought through as you were doing it. So for instance, if you use a much lighter weight yarn and you go, I've got the stitches are the size I want, the body width is the size I want, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you want the neck to drop down as much. So you're probably then going to start having to make modifications to perhaps make the neck wider. So that would just be in relation to neck versus body, assuming you got the size for the body you wanted. Then when you have changed the stitch gauge, you're also, generally speaking, going to have a corresponding change in row gauge. If you're given lengths, it's fine. If it says work until you have 14-inch body and then everything else is just done by giving you lengths, then there's no issues. But usually lengths are combined with knitting rows, where it says, have this number of decreases. You may have like 6 rows or 10 rows or 12 rows where you've got decreases or increases. If your row gauge is a lot tighter, it's going to mean that those rows take up much less space. So even though your other parts are going to match up. You could potentially, in those sections where you're just knitting rows, you could start introducing quite a bit of difference in the sizing. So with those, you'd have to recalculate how many inches those decreases or increases are going to take up, and make sure that you add in some extra rows straight, so to speak, when you're doing it. But those are the kind, like that's what I'm taking as an example where there's a huge difference in gauge. If you're talking about like a small difference in weight, then those changes that I've effectively taken to extreme by taking a very large gauge difference are going to have slightly less of an impact. But it kind of gets you thinking about how it all fits together and how you want it to fit you. So if you do want to make changes like this, the first thing you want to do is calculate the gauge, both the stitch gauge and the row gauge of the new yarn you want to use, so that you've got some really accurate information that you're working with. If there's stitch patterns, make sure you also swatch those and check those against the stitch pattern gauge you're given. The next thing you'll want to do is check your body sizes. So, you know, their bust, your shoulder width, the length you wanted, all of those things, so that you know what size you want when you come out with it. And then from there, you're going to have to go and combine the old gauge and the new gauge with the schematic so that you can recalculate for each of those little steps along the way. So that's kind of a general overview. Come on up and take a look with me now at how you can use the different row gauge and how that'll calculate. Very quick little calculation here to show you what a big difference, even a small difference in gauge can make. If you had a finished size in a garment that was a 40-inch bust size, and the pattern was meant to be knit at 5 stitches to 1 inch, but you decide, I've got a yarn I like and it gives me 6 stitches to 1 inch with the fabric that I like, let's see what happens with that. So if you took that bust size, and to get the actual finished size, this is assuming stockinette, of course, at that gauge instead of 5, is you'd have your 40-inch bust size, multiply it by the actual pattern gauge and divide it by your stitch gauge, and you're going to get the estimated bust size at the end. So you can see here that you are losing, even with just that smallish change in gauge, you're losing almost 7 inches in a bust size. So it has a phenomenal difference if you start making any kind of significant changes to the gauge. So if you're happy recalculating things like this, then go for it, but do be careful. And this is just looking at the stitch gauge. The same, of course, will happen with your row gauge. So now that we've talked all about how a change in gauge is going to impact the size of your garment and how you can use that to your advantage if you want, the next question that I had was all about changing between a cardigan and a sweater and a sweater and a cardigan. And this is really opening up a whole big can of worms, because there's a ton of different things that you can talk about in relation to this. So I'm kind of going to go through some of the basics and some of the easier ways to make that modification if we can. So first of all, let's take a look at changing between a sweater to a cardigan. Now this one is a woolly yarn, so this is soft trails, and the yarn is a woolen spun yarn, so it's very sticky, and that makes it ideal for using the method of using a steek. So if you haven't done a steek before, what it is you're literally going to cut your knitting, but before you do that, you make sure that the stitches on one side are stuck together and the stitches on the other side are stuck together in different ways so that they don't come apart. Now it sounds very scary, and if you haven't done it before, I would really suggest that you just put a little swatch together and you try out a couple of different techniques, because that way, if you do the swatch in the same yarn and the same stitch pattern as you've done on the sweater, you know how it's going to behave and you won't come up with any surprises. So that's really important. So the way you're going to do it, if you've got a sticky yarn, my preference would be for a crochet steek. So what you'll do is you'll mark the central stitch that you're going to want to cut. Usually like running a thread through it or something like that might help, so that you won't lose track of where you are. Then you'll get a fine yarn, a little lighter than the yarn you used in this, in a crochet hook, and you're going to join half of the stitch, one leg of the stitch, on the actual one you're going to cut. So the leg of the stitch you're going to cut, and join it with the stitch next to it. So you're taking one leg from this stitch, one leg from this, and you're crocheting them together, and you work all the way up the column of stitches along one side until they're all joined together. Then you're going to go down the other side and do the same thing, but with the other side of that same stitch. So you're taking the second leg of the stitch, you're going to crochet it together with the adjoining leg of the stitch on the other side. What's going to happen as you start working down that second side is the stitch will pull apart. And as it pulls apart, you'll just see this ladder of stitches starting to pier all the way down the middle. And that's what you're going to cut. So the reason for the crocheting on each side is it's basically joining the part you're going to cut with the other one to give it a little bit of cohesion, so it shouldn't unravel. Then you come back and you cut that ladder all the way up the middle, and it just forms a really neat opening. And if you've got an actual woolly yarn, so a bit of stickiness to it, while there'll be a few like loose threads, it kind of tends to stick to itself, and even more with time it just tends to get very sticky, and it's not going to unravel, particularly with that crochet chain. So that's how you cut it apart. If you've got a yarn that's not woolly and is very slippy and doesn't want to stick together, then you're going to use what's known as a sewn steek. And in that case, you're going to sew the same place, again, you'll have it marked up the middle, but instead of doing the crochet chain on this side and the crochet chain on this side, you're going to sew with the sewing machine up on one side, and you're going to sew on the other side. I'm not very good with a sewing machine, so I'm not the best person to give advice on this. I know you want to use a small stitch so that you're going to pick up and hold as many stitches as possible. And I know sometimes people might do a couple of lines down there to be extra sure that it's secure. But just be careful you don't create any puckering or stretching out of the fabric, is probably the biggest risk when you're sewing a fabric. Then once you've done that, you're going to do the same as before, and you're just going to cut up between the stitches across the middle. Now at this point you've got a front edge and it's been cut, but it's not particularly attractive because you've either got a crochet chain with little bits of strings hanging out of it, or you've got a strip of sewn knitting on each side. So both of those you're going to want to hide in some way. And the method of hiding, ideally you also want to make sure you incorporate a way of making it a little bit stronger, so that you're not going to have too much of a problem of it coming unravel or being worried about it being a weak point in the cardigan. So the best way of doing that is you come a few stitches back on each side, and through the work you're going to pick up and knit stitches all the way up along. So it'll be a few stitches in from either the crochet chain or where you've done your sewing. And when you pick those up, and then you get to go knit your button band. So you can either just knit it the width you want and finish it off, but then of course you ended with the back of it isn't going to look very attractive with the crochet chain or with the extra stitches. So what you could do is put a ribbon facing or something like that to cover over the inside of it, so it looks more attractive, and it's also going to give it a little bit more stability. So those are the kind of things you can do to kind of help if you want to just do a plain button band. Alternatively, you can do the sandwich effect, where you knit double length for the button band and it'll fold all the way over, and then the place where you picked up those stitches you can either pick up or seam onto it, so the whole thing forms a little sandwich with your steek in the middle. So it protects the steek and it covers it over. So I quite like that technique. I think it's a very clean, kind of knitterly way of doing it, and that would be probably my preference for front bands where you want to try and hide the steek. So that is definitely the most straightforward way of taking a sweater and changing it into a cardigan. And that can be done after you've finished knitting. But if you've at the start of the project and you're like, I'd actually like to go do a cardigan and I want to knit it as a cardigan, then you're going to have to go and start thinking about modifications and how you can do things differently. The one thing that I've had people ask very often, if they take, well, this is a sweater, but if you wanted to make a cardigan, if they can I just like knit it like the back or take a part down here? And the biggest difference you want to make with this is how the neck is treated and how it's divided. So this is top down. You can do the back of it out as far as here. With this, you only knit down as far as there, and then that's knitting the round. But if you want to do it as a cardigan, I'd suggest knitting the whole way down, or alternatively just knitting to the underarm and then joining the two sides and doing it front and back in rows. In the front, you've got increases for the neck coming down here, and then you cast on across the front of the neck here. So when you want to cast on the front here, if I had say 12 stitches across the front that were cast on, you're not going to divide it. Like instinctively, you're going to go, oh, then I want half and half. I'll put 6 on this side and 6 on this side. But you have to remember that you're also going to have to want to put a button band in. So you're going to need a certain amount of stitches in the middle that aren't going to be knit, because you're going to want to have space to put that button band in. So I would suggest picking your width of button band. Like in this case, we might say, I want 3 stitches to be left for a button band. That case, you'll cast on 3 stitches here. You cast on 3 stitches in the neck on that side, and then that middle 3 doesn't get cast on. It's going to be filled in when you do a button band down the front. So then you'd have your increased stitches, just a small amount cast on here, and you'd never join in the front. And then each side, you'll just work down from that point, and it's going to be the same as you would, the first part is, you're just not doing it back and forth in rows. The other thing you need to bear in mind with this is the body is worked in the round for this one from that point on. But if you're changing it to a cardigan, it's going to be flat. So you make sure you change any directions that said it was in the round. So if things are in the round, and you might have, if it was increases or decreases, make sure they're only on the right side to even it up. If you've got stitch patterns, keep working the flat stitch pattern directions. Don't start changing over to in the round, because you haven't moved into in the round. So that would be how you could change something from that was meant to be a sweater into a cardigan. But I've also had questions the other way around. This cardigan here is curdock, and it is one that I've had a few questions about that with. And the one thing that I've had people say is, can I just do the same as the back on the front? And the answer is up to a certain point, because for the stitch pattern, absolutely, you can make sure you could have the same stitch pattern and you could do the same thing on the front. One thing that you're going to do differently is similar to that one, is watch your neck. So in this case, you had your increases down as far as here, a little bit of a cast on, and then you did the same thing here, and then it was worked in one piece from that point down. For this, if you wanted to make a cardigan, make sure you still work those increases, but then make sure you cast on enough stitches across here that you're able to do all of the stitches you have here. So by the time you finish the neck increases, you're going to want the same amount of stitches on the front as you have on the back. So that way you can have the same stitch pattern, but you'll also have a scoop neck or a round neck on the front here, because if you had it straight across like the back, it's not going to be very comfortable, and it's not going to look very nice either. So you really don't want to do that part the same as the back and the front. But for the stitch pattern, you definitely could do it. So that's one thing to watch out for, is filling in the front where the button band is, how you would do the shaping of the neck. And the second thing that's probably more significant with this is, if you're going to then go working in the round, your stitch pattern is going to be different. So all of these are done flat. So the chart is showing right side and wrong side directions. If you've done charts with me before, you'll know that one of the reasons I love charts so much is that charts can very easily be converted. You can take a chart, and by reading it differently, you can use it for either flat or in the round. When it's flat, the right side is right to left, wrong side is left to right with the wrong side directions. If you have that chart and you want to work it in the round, you just read it differently. You just read each row from the right to the left, and you only use the right side directions. And other than that, everything else is the same. Like once you can read a chart, everything else is straightforward. If you use written directions, it gets a little bit trickier. I'd be mainly inclined to probably just read your knitting, kind of like knit your knits and purl your purls, if you can't follow the chart directions for working in the round. But they're really the big things. It's like watch your neck, be careful of a button band, and if there's stitch patterns, make sure you change them to either flat or in the round, or vice versa if you do the other way. But they're kind of the biggest things I'd suggest kind of watching out for. So I hope you enjoyed our episode, our vlog episode this week. I'm discovering that I'm kind of talking an awful lot about garments and garment modifications. And if you've done any modifications like this that you'd like to share with us, please go ahead and post up in the comments. Or if there's other tips that you want to share that worked well for you. Or just as importantly, if there was something that you weren't able to figure out that you'd like a little bit more insight on, please do pop it up, because it will make a really good episode and it will be fun to talk about, because it's nice to have starting points from things that people are working on, because I work best with real life examples rather than hypothetical ones. It's just much easier for me to interpolate that way and think about how you might possibly solve the problem. And if there's any other question knitting related, either technique or stitch patterns or modifications or anything along those lines, just post it up in the comments, and over the next few weeks I'd love to come and jump in and answer it for you. If you'd enjoyed the blog, make sure you are subscribing so that you will be notified when the next one comes out, and hopefully I'll see you in a couple of weeks with the next vlog. So thank you for joining me today.